Narrative-focused exploration games, or walking simulators as they're often dismissively called, are a contentious genre that either inspires vitriol or awe, with little in between. Either they're a new and immersive way to experience a thoughtful story, or they're an affront to gaming due to their minimal skill and limited interactivity. And to be fair, the genre is hit and miss. For every Gone Home, which features some superb storytelling and environmental design, there are plenty of other titles that slightly disappear up their own arse, and the player is largely reduced to a passive role. A haunted house without the scares, perhaps. Except Machine for Pigs, that's just a haunted house. Anyway, my point here is that What Remains of Edith Finch is considered to be one of the good ones. Routinely reviewed high and a strong recommendation from anyone who's willing to set aside 2 hours for a game that seeks to tell a story and little else. Developed by Giant Sparrow and published by the factory of thoughtful indie darlings Annapurna Interactive, What Remains of Edith Finch puts you in the shoes of the titular character as she returns to her family home after a long time away. And it swiftly becomes apparent that this home is not your standard family home. For a start, a rickety set of extra rooms has visibly been tacked onto the roof and threatens to fall off in a slight breeze, while walking into the house reveals an abundance of books that makes me feel better about my teetering to read pile. As you move around the house, you take part in various quirky mini-games that each tell the story of a member of the Finch family, all of whom died in bizarre circumstances. It's a beloved game, and one that I'd been meaning to try for years, and finally, I've gotten round to it. But now that I've finally played it, what did I think? Here's what remains of my thoughts on Edith Finch. Please be warned that there may be some spoilers.
I'm just going to start at the beginning.
A little while ago I made a video about video game houses, covering how houses helped video games tell their stories. And in that video I used Edith Finch as an example, and how the strange surroundings immediately point to who the Finch family are. I hadn't played the full game by this point, and its inclusion was a combination of crowdsourced suggestions and the brief time I spent with it back when I did a series called Ferret's Firsts. But now that I've played the full game, this environmental design is consistently striking. The rooms being sealed up as time capsules instead of renovated and reused, the mountains of books and clutter, the weird passageways, and rooms frozen in time are a key component of the game's story. The idea that the family can never move on from its many deaths is very apparent, and there's something fun about figuring out how to get around the sealed barriers that are the house's many doors. And the game's central concept is an intriguing one. A lot of people have died in bizarre accidents throughout the years, leaving only one child per generation growing into adulthood. And it's such a cool concept that really goes to some weird places. Some of the deaths seem ludicrous, but this adds to the game's charm, as it adds a layer of black humour. They could have kept the story tragic by putting childhood illnesses or traumatic murder as the deaths, but instead it's things like a child flying off a swing into the sea, or a man dodging death by hiding away for his whole life, only to emerge with a sense of determination and vigour, only to be immediately struck by a train. There's a bizarre whimsy to the deaths of the Finch family that makes the game feel almost like a collection of fairy tales or cautionary fables. And some of these stories are really stand out in their execution. The first one you encounter is a child recounting a bizarre experience where she turns into a cat, an owl, a shark, and then a sea monster, and then that sea monster comes to eat her. Each portion of this is a surreal shift without warning, as you suddenly jump out the window and move across a series of branches, and then out of nowhere, you take flight. The transformation into a shark is hilarious too, as you roll down a hill into the ocean, and the sea monster portion is suitably horrifying. It's a bit weird in its ending, but the experience of it is fun and a great introduction to just how weird this is all going to get. There are other highlights, including a visual novel and first-person horror hybrid segment that appears as a horror comic in its execution, and fits in some suitable Crypt Keeper-style gags along the way. One segment is told entirely through a camera, and taking the correct photo moves the story along, almost like if Pokemon Snap ended with the player being gored by a Stantler. And then there's a hugely elaborate segment where you control a fantasy adventure with the left stick, while the right stick performs tedious manual labour as the protagonist of that story steadily retreats into an imaginary world to escape how miserable his life is. This one in particular feels especially tragic, even with its whimsical presentation, and I have to commend them for this one. There's even a segment that's a fun little nod to Giant Sparrow's previous game, The Unfinished Swan. Sadly, not a full section where you get to throw paint around a white void, but it's still a neat nod. Also one that suggests a family member didn't die, and instead became a major character in a different game, which just adds to the weirdness even more. All of this comes together thanks to a series of consistently excellent voice performances. Edith herself is a likeable character even though we only know her through her limbs and her voice. Whoever played the pumpkin narrator of the horror comic deserves some sort of award, I just don't know what. And the tone is always consistently where it needs to be. No one ever comes across as overly morose or pretentious, it all just works.
I'm just gonna start at the beginning.
One of the things I've liked about some of my favourite so-called walking simulators is that while they exist to tell a story, they've utilised the non-linear nature of video games to great effect. In Gone Home, there's no specific route to uncovering everything in the house, and it's all down to the player's curiosity and choices as they play. Firewatch is a superb story that exists within a vast park that you can largely explore at your own leisure, and little secrets dotted about reward the player for doing so. This is where Edith Finch falls down. It's painfully linear. There are no branching paths that reveal extra tidbits, there are no hidden collectibles like the balloons in The Unfinished Swan, and the maze of a house feels less intriguing as it becomes clearer and clearer that there's a set order to everything you see. It railroads the player constantly, and I'm not just talking about the guy where a guy literally gets railroaded. And that's a shame, because it strips the player of any agency and pushes the game closer to the problem that many people have with games like this, that you could just adapt it to a non-interactive medium and it would still largely work. Now, the small stories of each family member feel like they could only work within a game, but they come with their own problems. Namely, this quirky nature of all these individual stories leads them to feel disconnected from each other. None of them really relate to each other, and the ambiguous endings most of them finish with can lead to them feeling inconsequential. At times, it can feel like playing the world's slowest game of WarioWare, presumably for when Nintendo decides it's time for Wario to finally die. An increasingly bizarre set of minigames get thrown at you revolving around the simplest of mechanics, and you have to simply complete them and move on to the next one. But instead of the 10 minutes of a WarioWare stage, it's 2 hours, and there are less wacky poses to perform with your Wii Remote. And the Unfinished Swan shoutout doesn't help this comparison, because it does make a lot of this feel like unfinished game concepts smushed together into one. And the main story doesn't do a great job of holding all this together either. While the concept of a cursed family is interesting, it never really goes anywhere with it. I get the game is kind of asking the player to consider mortality, but the bizarre nature of the deaths suggests much more is going on. Its black humour ends up working against it in that sense, and it made me endlessly curious about some ancient story in the family's history where someone pissed off a shaman or something. A story that never comes. And then the ending arrives and it just sort of fizzles out. It's not a satisfying ending, and one that sort of stumbles through the themes the game has set up. It also makes the experience feel a little pointless, and once again presents a case for where the weirdness of the family deaths leads us to believe it's leading to something that then never happens. In fact, the black humour of the game clashes with the bland tragedy of the ending, and maintains the sense that the game is a little disjointed.
This is where your story begins.
Well, sort of. Edith Finch is a messy but intriguing experience of a game. It's not as good as other similar narrative games due to its extreme linearity and somewhat inconsequential story, but it's still an interesting experience. The individual parts of What Remains of Edith Finch are generally excellent, it just fails to add up to the sum of those parts. Did I like Edith Finch? Yeah. Did I love it? No. Would I recommend it to others? Maybe. If you're someone who enjoys these types of games, haven't yet played this and have 2 hours spare, feel free to give it a try. It will probably leave you with some mixed feelings, but there is likely to be something you enjoy in it. Hell, considering this game's general critical success, you may even love it in a way that I didn't. But if you're the kind of person who sneers at walking simulators, it won't change your mind. In fact, it may reinforce your beliefs. It is linear, it is limited in its interactivity, and it is a little artsy-fartsy, I guess. But I'm less averse to that, so that's why there were parts I definitely liked. But I'm both glad this game exists, and that I played it. It was messy and flawed, but it played with conventions and it stands out as a unique passion project. and it's proof that there is room for a number of ideas within the gaming space, and that's always something to celebrate. And all that remains is to remind you to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, or if you can, toss some support my way over on Patreon like these lovely people, or come and say hi in the new Discord community. You can also check out some of my other videos, such as the previous episode of this series, which is about Hollow Knight, or why not check out my look at various video game houses. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.